On today's show, we talk to two-time Grammy-nominated composer, arranger, orchestrator, conductor, and big band leader Tim Davies, one of the busiest conductors and orchestrators in Hollywood. We talk about his development in Australia, how he got his start in the film, TV, and video game industry, his approach to orchestration and composing, the many films and video games he's worked on, his big band, and much, much more. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Nikhil Hogan Show. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show. Joining me today is the amazing two-time Grammy-nominated composer, orchestrator, band leader, drummer, and educator, Tim Davies, on the show for the first time. Tim is one of the busiest conductors and orchestrators in Hollywood. His film and TV credits include La La Land, Trolls, Minions, Ant-Man, the recent Ant-Man and the Wasp, Empire, the Peanuts movie, the Muppets, Lego, Ninjago, and Frozen. He is also one of the most prolific orchestrators and conductors in the world of video games, having worked on multiple titles from the God of War series, Infamous, Sims, Resistance, and Batman, the Arkham series. He plays drums and writes for his own group, the 18-piece Tim Davies Big Band, and received Grammy nominations for Best Instrumental Composition in 2010 and 2016. In 2013, he launched his orchestration blog, www.de. How do you say that, Tim?
Debriefed. It's like a semi-breathed.
Right, debriefed.
But taken apart, so I debriefed it.
Which has since become an important resource for composers and orchestrators all over the world. Hey, Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
What an honor, and so many things to ask you. You've had such a great career, and you've been doing some of the biggest. I mean, the movies that are in your credit list are some of the biggest movies of all time. Does that ever hit you, considering that the work that you've done has made billions of dollars and millions of people have seen it?
I wish it had made me billions of dollars, but I mean, I can't really complain. No, it's been good. No, it is. I was adapting a little bio for a talk I'm giving in Australia next week, and I was trying to work out, well, what have I done, and I worded it something like, I've been able to put my stamp on modern orchestral recording, which I know it's not really related exactly to the movies, but that's what I do, and that's sort of the most fun part of what I do is, going and conducting these large orchestras for these recordings, for the scores. And it's like the only outlet for that in the world is doing this, on these big movies. And I get to sort of mold how these scores come together in my small little way. Obviously, I'm doing the bidding of the composer and the director. I'm just trying to make their vision come to life. But I get to guide it and work out ways of doing things and tricking things. A lot of the time now, thanks to the demo process and composers that might not be completely orchestrally trained, they'll write impossible things for the orchestra, and it's my job to work out how we're going to record it, or break the news to them that we can't, which, I rarely do. Normally I find a way. So that's my sort of, thought on, the question of, when I see all these movies and everything, it's like, yeah, I had a little part to do with it.
Now, when people see music in the credits, they think the composer really does everything, but it's not true because there's a huge team behind everything, and the orchestrator has a very important role to play. So you work with the composer in a big way. And what, if I could ask as an example, let's take the most recent movie, Ant-Man and the Wasp.
Yep.
That movie, when the composer passed you, how does the composer pass you the music? Is it in a computer form, or is it like a lead sheet? Does he give you some kind of mock-up? How does it all kind of work?
Yeah. On nearly everything these days, the composer has gone through the process of writing it and doing a mock-up or demo in their computer, or have someone doing that with them for them. And, they spot the movie with the director and find out where the music's going to go, and then they write it, and then they go backwards and forwards. Sometimes once, sometimes 10 times with the director until they get it right, for the picture. And then it comes to me in that form. So it's been produced at a computer. Some composers can do amazing demos and it sounds, pretty close to a real orchestra. There's still some things missing that, you need with the real orchestra, and that's why they still spend hundreds of thousands of dollars doing this. But I get that in computer form, usually a MIDI file and some stems and a mix. So I get the mix of the whole demo, and then I get stems, which are breakdowns of each section of the orchestra and all of the synthesizers and other elements in there, so I can dissect it, and then I put it back together in the score. So it's really a translation job a lot of the time.
You've likened it to a sort of a puzzle in a way.
Yeah, exactly. It's a puzzle, and as I mentioned earlier, sometimes, Chris Beck. He knows exactly what he's doing with the orchestra. He writes, for one orchestra. Ant-Man was a rare case in an action movie where we did not do any overdubbing with the orchestra, meaning it's really only one orchestra's worth of players playing at any one time, whereas a lot of action movies these days have multiple passes with the orchestra. They're all playing short note riffs, and then they all play the melody, and then, it builds up into what, if you tried to play that live, it might take 2 or 3 full orchestras of people. Whereas with Chris, he generally writes for one orchestra and we record it all at the same time. We were at Abbey Road for Ant-Man and the Wasp. And so anyway, he gives me the file and I listen to it, and I'll have someone make the sketch from his Cubase file, and then I will get that into Finale, and then I work with it and, listen to the demo, and I work out what the intent is from the demo for the players, and then I, voice it and give it the articulations and the dynamics and fill in any parts that are missing, trick any parts that can't be played, as in if there's a section where the brass might have to breathe, but I know we can't, then I have to write it, and trick it around it, or more often than not these days I have to plan how we'll record it. The scenes are changing all the time, and what might have been a really simple tempo map with everything, the one beat for a long time, by the time the film's edited, that might be jumping all around, and the orchestra has to change tempos really quickly, and 85 humans can't just jump tempo. So I have to work out how to record that, whether we stop and start, or whether we trick it some other way, and then who stops and starts, and how we do the editing. So I'm part Pro Tools editor, part orchestrator, part translator, part mind reader, and conductor. Yeah, and conducting is where I put it all together. And then when we get to the session, so I've made the score, done my best job, and then that goes to the copyists and they make all the parts, and then we go to the session and I'm there conducting it, we run it down, and then I'll work out where we have to stop and start. It's very rare that we'll record, if it's more than a minute, it's rare that we'll record it in one go. We'll stop, at different sections for editing control and also just for performance to make it easier to play. And then I'll get the feedback from Chris, maybe the director, on what they want. Then I'll make the changes. Sometimes it's simply just play that bit a little louder. Other times it's like that needs to be darker or brighter or something, and I'll revoice it and change it. So there's a lot of changing on the fly at the session. Anyway, and then finally, after a couple of runs through, we've got it, and then we move on to the next one.
A big movie like that, how many months, how many weeks would a typical movie like that take out of your schedule?
For me, it's not that long. I mean, Chris likes to hold it back until the last minute. So the best case scenario with a Chris movie is probably about 3 weeks before the sessions I'll get the music. A lot of that's not even his fault, really. It's that because of the editing these days, they'll edit right down to the wire. So, even after we've recorded, they're still editing the movie. And that's when the music editors come in, because they'll go and cut the music and edit that. But anyway, they'll be waiting till they get a scoring lock. It used to be that you get a locked picture, meaning that it was not going to change the edit anymore. But that's never going to happen now. So we'll pick a date where we'll take a scoring lock, meaning that's the cut that we're going to record to. Even if you keep changing it, we're not going to keep changing because we just can't keep chasing you. We have to decide. So usually 3 weeks, worst case 2 weeks out, they'll pick the scoring lock, and then we will. That's when we'll start to get the music, because they'll have gone and conformed all that. Because every time the picture changes, someone has to go through and change all the music timing to match the new change. And so anyway, 3 weeks or so out. And Hotel Transylvania 3, which I did at the same time with Mark Mothersbaugh, the editing for that was really together. And so they had the lock and there was no changes coming down. We started 3 or 4 weeks out, and we didn't have to revise anything. Whereas Ant-Man got behind and they kept changing the movie, like actually reordering scenes, and they would reshoot scenes and everything. So even though they waited as long as they could, music was still being changed. So I would have to reorchestrate certain cues before we even got to the orchestra.
And does that mean bringing the orchestra into the recording studio again and again and again? Or is that just a couple of times you have to edit from what you've recorded, or you have multiple recording sessions? Well,
normally it used to be that you would go for your 4 or 5 days and that would be it. And any small changes would be edited. Now it's quite common, especially on Marvel movies, to record your full score. Then, they'll mix it and they'll be dubbing the movie, and then they'll make changes. So you'll go back with the orchestra for another day or two of pickups, where you'll fix anything that needs fixing that can't be edited. So we'll reorchestrate. This time with Ant-Man, because it was all running behind and they were constantly changing the movie, we couldn't do that. We originally were doing 6 days and then a month later going back for 2 days. We ended up doing 2 days and then a week and a bit off, then 2 days and then a week off, then 2 days, and then, it just spread out these 2-day blocks. So I was backwards and forwards to London, and then sometimes I just stayed over there. Luckily, Hotel Transylvania 3 was recording over there as well, so I just lived at Abbey Road for, on and off for 2.5, 3 months earlier in the year.
Do you ever talk to the director, or are you mainly working with the editors, the music editors, and the composer?
Generally, no. Generally, I'm below that. The composer and the director have the relationship, and I'm just there to facilitate, what the composer wants. At the session, the directors will often be there, and occasionally they will, want to change something, and then I'll be involved in the discussions sort of at the request of the composer. But generally, I stay out of that. If the composer and the director are having a discussion, they will have that, and then Chris, or Mark will then ask me to do something, or they might call me in and say, listen, but it's not my role to sort of get involved in that. That's the composer's job, unless it's something that I've been more involved in, like several years ago with Book of Life with Gustavo Santaolalla, where I put that score together, sort of arranged it myself from all of his themes and everything. So I was the one talking to the directors and the producers and everything. So that was a different experience. But in 99% of what I do, the composer deals with all of that. I don't even watch the movie when I work. I might watch it early. They'll send it to me to get a feel for it.
And when they send it to you, it has no music. It's just sound and video.
No, it'll have music temp score.
Oh, I see, the temps. Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes I might watch it a little later, so that some of the composers' demos might already be in it. Like when I watched La La Land, there was no temp. It was all Justin's music was already in the movie. So I got a good feel for it, although it was quite an early cut.
Oh, these are some phenomenal movies you're name dropping. Actually, one thing I want to do, I want to do this, Tim. I want to actually, if we could go a little bit back. I'm very, very curious about how you got started in music, because you're this major player in Hollywood, and I'm just so curious. And I think you've said in an interview before that you didn't quite expect this, right? This, how it kind of turned out. And so no. I'm so curious how it started. So first of all, how did you get into music to begin with?
Well, I originally started playing the drums in year 4 at school, mainly just to get out of class for an afternoon, because that's when the music lessons were. It was a Tuesday afternoon. But, I liked that, and then I liked playing in the school band, and then I joined a community concert band and was lucky enough to have parents that they weren't musical, but they supported me in my music and drove me all over town to drum lessons and rehearsals. And
was that like a jazz band?
No, the first stuff I did was concert band, like a wind orchestra kind of vibe. And then I didn't really ever play orchestra until I was in college, and then only very rarely. Because, so I started, I was playing the drums, and then in high school I started playing some saxophone as well. And that's when I got into big bands and hearing that was the first sound that really grabbed me. And I remember hearing high screech trumpet in a big band, and I thought, wow, that's like the best sound on the planet. I want to do that and have my own, screech trumpet player in the backyard. So I sort of set about learning to write for a big band.
And that was in college? So did you start to write in college? Is that what happened?
Yeah. Basically at the end, it was funny. Like I told everyone I was doing it and I could do it, but I never actually did it. It was one of those, if you build it, they'll come, because I just I put my mouth before my money. And
good strategy.
But I was writing a bit of everything. Like the story, goes that, when I was at the conservatorium in Queensland, I was actually studying classical percussion first, but I was starting to write and arrange, and I wasn't actually writing big band. I was sort of looking into it, but I hadn't cracked it yet. And but I was, definitely jazz inspired, and I was writing jazz ensemble pieces and jazz pieces, but I was also writing my normal orchestral music for my degree, because I eventually did change majors at the end of my undergraduate to composition, once sort of I realized I didn't want to play triangle at the back of the orchestra for a living.
You mentioned that Daley Wilson was a big influence on you as a child. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that was this Australian band, and that was this cassette that I was given by some friends that were cleaning out their collection when I was about 12. And it was this Australian big band led by a guy, Warren Daley, and Ed Wilson. And Warren Daley was the drummer, and Ed Wilson played the trombone. And they credited everything to both of them, the arrangements and the compositions and everything. So I sort of just assumed that Warren was writing the arrangements as well. I did get to meet them. I've met them and hung out with them since. I mean, the band folded many years ago, but I found out that sort of Ed, the trombonist, was the arranger and the technician, and Warren was more the producer and the ideas man. But it was a combination of the two that made this amazing music. And what I also didn't know at the time was a lot of it was inspired by the big bands from over here. But because it was before the internet, we didn't really know that they were kind of knocking off what was going on in America. But they were sort of, I like to say they, Australianized and improved it, because they certainly put a spin on it. Anyway, it was just a very full-on sound, very on top of the beat, very energetic, and that's sort of the sound that inspired me that I went with, in my writing.
When you were in college, were you well versed in all these records, even the ones from America, like Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa and all those types of recordings?
Honestly, I wasn't. I remember discovering in college things like Chick Corea, Return to Forever, that had a huge impact on me. And then we had one class. One of the teachers, Gerard Brophy, who was a great contemporary composer, we had a class where he would just bring in CDs and records and scores from all over the place, and we would sit there and listen and just talk about it. I don't think they have classes like that anymore, because there's no assessment, but it was a great class, and I learned and I heard a lot of things. That's where I heard like Stockhausen, and his sons, Marcus and Simon, had a fusion band called Paris that I got into. So I had sort of these weird influences of that, and then this Australian big band, which really shaped my music before I heard, a lot of the great American big bands. I didn't actually study jazz. I was always doing legit music. So I didn't go through the jazz history program and wasn't exposed to everything. But I think that sort of led to my unique take on everything, was not having heard all of that stuff until later. And so I was putting these pieces together for multimedia things with tape and sequences and light shows.
Did that happen organically at the end of college?
Well, this was in college.
Okay. And what was your concentration actually in college, your major?
Well, I started as a percussion major, doing orchestral percussion and marimba and timpani and all of that sort of stuff. I was playing drums just for fun, but I never actually did that in college. And I did a little bit of saxophone as a second study. And then in about fourth year, I switched to composition. So I finished my degree as a composition major because I was doing more writing and enjoying that more than playing triangle. Excuse me. But I ended up doing all of these things in my spare time. I tried to multi-track an orchestra in the middle of the night because I could get into the studio. It was a disaster. But I had no idea that I would find this job now and be doing that and then writing pieces,
Now, if I asked you, like, if I could take you back in time and you were doing all these things in college, that what you'd be doing right now would be your future, what would you say to yourself?
I had no idea I'd be over here. I mean, I came to America sort of by accident, and staying was an accident. I didn't even know this job existed here, but it's like my perfect job for my skills and my temperament and what I love doing. But yeah, I was doing it all in college, but not as part of my degree. It's interesting now they have degrees in all of this stuff. You can skip all the classical music now, and you can just do recording and studio and writing for picture and everything. And I kind of think that's a shame in a way, because I have this foundation of all of the classical music. And then, I did all of this extra stuff, in my spare time. Luckily, the university I was at was really encouraging, and I had some great teachers that really encouraged, all of this extracurricular activity. And we had the facilities and a great bunch of other students that would be involved. I didn't have to pay them anything. I could just, convince them to come in and play, and I would put together my own orchestra for concerts and all these sorts of things. And, my first orchestral piece I've got the score of, and when I look at it, it's almost the same way I would write it now, just by pure fluke, even though I didn't know what I was doing. I never even took orchestration as an elective.
You mentioned that you, on your blog, Debriefed, you mentioned that you learned a lot by doing. But did you actually self-study in any way, or read any of the orchestral books, like the Korsakov book and the Berlioz book on orchestration? Did you look at those books at all?
I mean, I looked at them from occasionally from a reference standpoint, but no, I never really studied them. In fact, the first time I bought all those books was when I started the blog. I thought I better at least at what they said. So I went on an Amazon shopping spree, and that's when I bought them all, because the only one I had through college as a textbook was the Kennan.
And that's right.
That's a very, very direct textbook kind of type one. And you could read, on my blog, my thoughts on the books and why I think a lot of them are flawed, which is because they're based in examples from different eras, and there's performance practice, and the relationship between the notation and how the orchestra plays is set. They know it already, whereas what we do now is sight reading. There's no expectation of what it's going to be like. So we're in a vacuum in a way. And that's been my sort of thought and idea with the orchestral default concept and that sort of thing. But no, I can't quote any of those books.
Did you have any orchestration mentors or any older people that kind of helped you build your skill set?
Well, yeah. I mean, I did my undergraduate, and didn't do a ton of orchestral writing apart from just, stuff for my own little concerts. But even then, that was mainly because of the style. It was more, tonal and everything. That wasn't what I was writing for. It wasn't that experimental, the orchestral music I was writing. So it really wasn't connected to my degree. I'd be writing other pieces for my lessons. But when I got to Melbourne to do my master's, I picked a teacher. His name's Brenton Broadstock, because I had heard one of his symphonies in this actual class where that teacher would come in and play. This one class with Brophy sort of set me up in so many different ways, and it's such a shame that that's the type of class that now is non-existent in conservatoriums, because there's no end game with it. They can't assess it. It's just a waste of 2 hours lecture time now, for them to put it on. It wasn't a history class, we had that separately. It was just pure listening and exposure. And so anyway, one of the pieces he played one day is Toward the Shining Light, which is a symphony by Brenton Broadstock. And I went, that's what I identify with. That's who I want to study with. And so I sought him out, and I went and met him, and we got along, and we're friends to this day. I see him every time I go to Melbourne, and he's been to visit me here a couple of times. And and he's a great orchestrator. So with him, I did definitely work on some orchestral music, and he had a great effect on me and pointed me in the right direction on a lot of things. But that was, I was in my 20s, and so I just had absorbed from a lot of listening and looking at other scores a style and my own ideas, and then he sort of helped sort of cement that, because we had sort of similar styles anyway.
Were you using technology even early then? Were you now you mentioned Finale. Back then, were you using pen and paper, or were you kind of also starting to use technology in your orchestration?
When I first started, it was all pencil, and my first composition folios at the end of the year were pencil. But then in 1994 was when I got my first computer and copy of Finale. So that's when I sort of changed over. And I remember, doing my first arrangements. It was my first professional arranging gig. It was the Christmas Carols concert in Brisbane. And I had to do these arrangements, and I couldn't even get the chords to work. So I'd have to print it out and still write the chord symbols in by hand.
Right.
And it was apparently they're still using one of those charts.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I hear from someone every now and then. But yeah, so 1994, that was the year I started, and then I sort of got more and more into it as I went along, whereas now I'm in their brochure. I'm at one with it. I've hacked it into doing things that it shouldn't do.
You're very well known in the video game community as one of the more prolific orchestrators and conductors in video games, some major titles. And you yourself, you've mentioned you don't really play video games yourself, much like you don't listen to film music. How did you get into working with video games?
Well, my first actual proper job in Hollywood was a video game. A friend who I studied with at USC, Jim Dooley, we worked together on a couple of little projects right after school, and then he went off to work for Hans Zimmer as an assistant, and then finally broke out into his own room and down at Remote Control, or it was Media Ventures at the time, and then it became Remote Control. Anyway, he's a great writer, and he got this gig with Sony computer games called SOCOM 3, and he asked me if I would orchestrate it, and I'm like, sure, because I was like the class orchestrator, because I didn't want to write film scores or game scores myself. I was quite happy to orchestrate and conduct and arrange and do all that sort of stuff. So he asked me if I would do it. I wanted to conduct it as well, but no one was going to let me because I'd never done it before. So we had someone else booked, but then as fate would have it, they got sick, couldn't make it to London. So I then got the gig to conduct it as well. So I went off and orchestrated it and conducted it at London at Air Studios. And that was my first real project.
How did you feel? Were you pretty nervous?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't really, get super nervous on the outside, hopefully. I mean, that's the trick, right? If you're especially when you're going to be a conductor standing in front of all those people, you can't let the nerves show. So,
Yeah.
Hopefully it's just all on the inside. But I was just like, this is amazing. I'm getting paid to do what I used to do for fun and put together. And there is an extra little element to conducting your own music, obviously. But I still can enjoy, conducting anything or orchestrating it and putting the puzzle, back together and then hearing the results. And then if it works the first time, you're like, I did it, And, because the goal is to write it in a way that it sounds like it's been played before. There's some people who'll just sort of get it close and then think, oh, we'll fix it and we'll massage it there. And I'm like, no, I want it right, If we only have 2 minutes left in the session and we got a 2-minute cue to record, it's got to work. So, but anyway, that was my first job, was this SOCOM 3 with Sony, and that relationship with Sony still goes till we just finished 2 weeks ago the music on the new Spider-Man game. It's not technically not a Sony game, I don't think, but their Sony music department sort of helps out a lot of other game companies these days, and I do a game, every 1 or 2 years with them, and it was through them that I met Gustavo Santaolalla, and I worked with him on a game called The Last of Us.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you about that. That is one of the most acclaimed games ever. And talk about that. Talk about working on that project.
Well, that was a lot of fun. So Sony have always given me a lot of more creative freedom than sort of any other orchestrator, because I've worked with them for so long.
Now, first of all, that's a very, very long game. So that must be a ton of music, right?
There was. So what happened on that one was actually Gustavo wrote his music. He basically just wrote tracks, which is how he works. He's an amazing composer and musician, and he just gets told what the vibe is, and then he goes into his studio with his friend and producer Annabelle, and they come up with this amazing stuff. And sonically, it's also very, very good. He has a total sound world, and they come up with some unique things. So he did that. Then they gave it to me, and on some of it I wrote, orchestra. We picked a unique sounding orchestra, and I wrote that on top of the tracks. But then I wrote a whole bunch of other stuff inspired by it, or arranging it, or tweaking it, or making weird sounds inspired off that, and then that got given to the people putting it all in the game, and then they manipulated it even more, and it was this whole long process of lots of stuff going into the games.
Do you kind of like, I remember, I'm thinking of Brian Wilson when he did his Pet Sounds, he put his feet in the sand to think of the beach. Now, did you watch The Walking Dead? Did you read up on zombie apocalypses? Did you get in the mood by looking at some source material?
No, I've never been that kind of. It's not. No, I just get told what they want, and then for some reason I can do it. I just can be inspired by the music. I mean, I knew the idea of the game, and I'd seen clips from it, obviously, and worked with it. But I knew what Gustavo had done, and I knew what they wanted me to do because I'd done this sort of thing with them before. And the amazing thing was they didn't need to hear any of this. So normally you would have to do demos of everything, but because this involved a lot of, unique orchestral things that couldn't be done, textures and tricks and techniques and stuff that couldn't be done in a computer, I didn't have to demo it. So I just wrote for like a couple of weeks everything I could think of, and then we went and recorded it all. And some of it we would start, and then they would go, nah, let's just skip this one. And then I'm like, not a problem. The next one, because we had so much material. And because I didn't have to waste any time doing demos and going through approvals, I just wrote, a way more music than we'd need. And then they could pick and choose what they wanted.
Now, Tim, when you're composing as well, do do you think, do you have harmonies in mind, chords? Do you think melody? Do you think rhythm? What's your process, your compositional process?
Generally, like on Trollhunters, and this is the same as process the first part of this is the same process of, anything, like when we're talking about Chris on Ant-Man or something, like you spot it, then you go home and you watch it, and there'll be the temp score will be in there. Hopefully it's a good temp score. And if you've got a great temp, then, it can be quite easy to get the vibe of what they're trying to go for. I'll always ask in the spotting meeting, do they like the temp? If they do, then I've got half the work's done for me already. I hear all of these, you read on forums, these young composers, and they're like, oh, I'm never going to listen to a temp, and I'm not going to have, I'm going to refuse to do it.
So you like the temps then?
Of course, I love the temp. I mean, why would you want to spend 6 months backwards and forwards finding the direction, writing all of this music that's going to end up nowhere because you have to try and mind read. You might get it right the first time, but a temp means that someone else has sat there and thrown up a lot of different music against it already and come up, narrowed it down a little bit. And if it's done properly and you've got a director and a producer that understand what's going on, they don't fall in love with it, then, everyone goes on about temp love, which is where the director falls so much in love with the temp that no matter whatever you write, it's not going to be good enough. And then...
Has that happened before?
I have one incident on Trollhunters where it was interesting. It was a scene that it was quite a big scene, and they had picked this music that was a licensed cue, and all along they were going to keep it because it just worked and they liked it and it had been in there so long. So I had no trouble on any other cue with the temp. I would only think twice did they say in 52 episodes, can you go back and listen to the temp because, something's not right about what you did. And I would often just disregard it anyway and do, once I got into the show and it became my voice anyway, I would know what to do. That's the one thing with, Guillermo del Toro. He picks people for roles somehow. He's got this extra skill of just knowing whatever they do is what it should be. He works with the same actors all the time and the same people, and he picks people out by seeing their work, and he goes, I think that person will do the right thing in this job. So he saw something in me for the Trollhunters music where he's like, whatever Tim does is what's going to be Trollhunters music, But anyway, there was this one particular scene, and they had this cue. And at the time, I was swamped with work because I was trying to keep up my orchestrating and conducting and write the score. So at the time, I remember thinking, that's great. That's 2.5 minutes of music I don't have to write. So I just let it go. I was like, I don't really care. It saves me time. They're happy. No one will notice or whatever. It's not a big deal. And I let it go. I didn't even watch that scene ever again because I knew I didn't have to worry about it, and I wrote the bit before it and a bit after it, and all was good. Anyway, then in one of the later episodes, there was a similar sort of scene, and they put that similar cue in, and they wanted to keep it. Anyway, this time it bugged me, and because it sounded, quite radically different to what the music was I was writing, but also it didn't have any of my themes in, or any of Alexandre's theme, who wrote the main theme for the show, and so it really bugged me. But I let it go, and then I'm like, I call my assistant, and I'm like, Ryan, I think I'm going to write a cue and just send it to them and see what happens. And he's like, yeah, do it. We got time. So I wrote this cue and I based it off their temp, which was their cue that they were going to use. And it turned out really good. I mean, I liked it. It was sort of more full on than anything else. I tried to write Trollhunters, even though it was completely fake orchestra. We never recorded a live one. I tried to write it like it could be recorded. So I didn't pile up, 3 or 4 orchestras at once. But on this cue, to go against the temp, I had to do that. So it was like this massive thing. I sent it in, And I get feedback from one producer, and he's like, "Wow, that's amazing! Like I love it." And then the main director, Rodrigo, he was the showrunner. He's like Guillermo's guy there. He's like, "Yeah, I like it. I really appreciate what you're doing. And everything. Let's have a look at it. There's a bit that's working." And so I went in, and the bit that he thought was not working was not the bit that I thought was not working. In fact, it was a bit that wasn't even in the original, but he had heard it different now with the new music. But he kept every time we would talk about this, he would like, "I can't guarantee it though. I can't guarantee it." Anyway, I worked on it, and it was probably the most backwards and forwards I did on a cue for Trollhunters, and it got to they had done the temp dub, which was the day before the dub, and I thought it was in, and then I get a phone call from Rodrigo, and he's like, "Man, I just
we're not going to keep
wanted to let you know that there's something about the temp. I'm just going to go with it. I'm just going to do it." And I was hoping that he was going to send it to Guillermo, and that Guillermo would. I knew Guillermo would go with my piece, but Guillermo didn't get a chance to listen to it. Before it was too late. So I didn't. So anyway, I got overruled on that one, and so that was. I'm still bummed about that.
Maybe we'll get to hear it one day. Who knows? Maybe it's there somewhere.
Yeah. Well,
right?
I did get to use the cue. The opening of the final episode of the last season uses bits of it, so it's you hear it. So I did get to use it because they had temped it there, but this time it wasn't an issue. But that sort of thing and that backwards and forwards is just part of the process. Like we had that discussion. I mean, I felt bad, but then move on, and it doesn't affect anything really. Like I've still got the gig.
What company was Trollhunters under?
DreamWorks.
I see. And so you've pretty much worked with most of the large movie companies. And in 2013, you worked on Frozen, which is, that movie is one of the biggest of all time, and that's Disney. And were you were conducting on that movie?
Yeah, I did some of the orchestrating and conducted most. I did all the underscore and about half the songs for it.
So how is it working for Disney and such a big important movie for them? What was that experience like?
It's a unique one in that the Disney, it's a very musical studio. And especially in a movie like Frozen, there's a legacy. So there's a lot more cooks on those sessions. But everyone's super cool. It was great, but there's a lot more. There's so many more people that have a say. Like on an Ant-Man, the director listened occasionally, but, at the session, he didn't even come to the sessions. He listened online a few times, but by that stage, the music was in good shape, but he was doing other things anyway. But at like something like Frozen, all of the directors, the studio people are there, the music department. There's music supervisors, music producers, music executives, and all of these people. And even actually, I remember Frozen. We had all the animators came in. We would have like rows of seats set up, and I would look around, and all of a sudden there was 20 people sitting behind me because it was so cool for them to come out and see it. And so they were hanging out at the recording, because the recording sessions are basically fun, right? It's the fun part at the end of the movie, and if it's in good shape, then it's really fun. If the movie's still a bit of a mess, then we're sort of looked at to try and fix it. But, it's a really exciting environment for everyone to be in. So we get a lot of people come by from the production. But anyway, working on Frozen, at the time we had no idea what it was going to be, that it was going to be such a huge hit. And I remember just before that, I hadn't done a ton of animation, and I was up to work on a big animated movie with someone, and they were questioning, whether I'd done any, big animation or any animation. And, a year later I had worked on then obviously the biggest animated movie of all time. So
That's
I
right.
don't, no one has any issues with me working on animation now.
In the industry, do you get tested like that? Do you constantly get your credits and your CV looked over as you move from project to project?
I think at this stage, everyone, who's going to hire me knows of me or whatever. They might look at your IMDb to see, what you've done. And a studio, if they don't know you, but they sort of all know me now. But, occasionally there's new executives or people that come through, so they'll look up and just see, because they're basically going to entrust you with a Ferrari to drive around that's not yours, and you don't want to crash. So it's being entrusted with the orchestrating and then the conducting is a big role. And occasionally they'll bring me in to sort of shepherd it through, on La La Land. Justin, and it was interesting. Justin had actually read my blog, because he had, he'd written a lot of stuff, but this was the first time, he was writing a big studio orchestral score, and he hadn't recorded one before, and there's a lot of things that we do and stuff that until you've done it, you won't know. So, the studio brought me in early to meet with him and just chat and go through the scores and work out how we'd record things and what we couldn't do and what we could do, and just work out our plans so that when we got there with the orchestra, because, it's very expensive. We had, I think the largest orchestra for La La Land was something like 95 people one day. And that's a lot of money. So, the studio, had me go in early and meet with him, and, we worked out a big plan on how we would record all of this. He did all the, he wrote it all and he actually orchestrated it all. I gave him some pointers, and, he listened to a couple of them, but, he really had a vision for how he wanted it to go. And so then my job was to facilitate that and make sure it happened.
You had all that experience over these years working with big orchestras and working with
conducting.
Exactly. Yeah. So you were kind of consulting and helping him.
Exactly. I'm not trying to overstate my role at all. He really did all of the stuff, but I facilitated it for him. I shepherded it through.
I want to talk about your big band. And I want to talk specifically about, you were nominated twice for 2 Grammys, one in 2009 for Counting to Infinity, and then in 2016, the epic Serenade for double big band, the expensive train set. Let's quickly just go over, talk about Counting to Infinity a little bit.
Well, that was, on the first, on that album, wasn't my second album, but I had basically a 4-movement trilogy, which is another whole story, based on some, recurring nightmares and crazy dreams that I would have. And that one was based on one where I was I haven't had it recently, but I was basically in a pit of sand on a beautiful beach that I couldn't see. And I had to count every grain of sand in the world. It was like this feeling. Yeah, an incredibly weighted feeling, right? It's quite depressing.
That's a dream that goes on and on then.
Exactly. So I like to come up with these, stories or pictures to paint, and then it helps write the piece. But then, because of, it's sort of a very, far-fetched line, but obviously in Australian Aboriginal culture, they have the dream time, which is what they call, where all of their stories and myths come from, a period they call the dream time. Anyway, and so I thought of the Aborigines, and I thought didgeridoo. That's what I need. And the piece, basically had a riff that I'd written.
The didgeridoo is a very long kind of a tube instrument that the Aboriginals in Australia blow into. Is that correct?
Yeah, other cultures have used it as well, but it's sort of mostly associated with Aboriginal culture, and you blow into it and you circular breathe, so it's continuous, and then you growl and you shout and you make other noises with your throat to color it, and they sort of simulate birds and animals and cries and screams and all that, but you can also there's some great contemporary players that can sort of play beats on it. But anyway, I thought, wow, let's put that with the big band. And I tried it out and it worked really well. And I'm convinced I got that nomination just because the introduction had the didgeridoo, the piece is too long for anyone to listen to the whole thing. But then, I put sort of the trippiness and the dream aspect into some of the music and the feeling of what am I going to do and dread and all of that. I try to put in, not too literally, but it's still a big band piece. It's got to have a beat and excitement and everything like that. So, but that's how that came about. And then I was lucky enough to get nominated for the piece, which is great.
And then you moved, and then the next nomination you had, 2016, was the expensive train set. And you have the epic Serenade, but Serenade is spelt Sarah, like the name, Nade. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, that was because my daughter's Sarah, with an H, and I'd already written a piece for her called Saraband, which, a saraband is a slow dance in 3. So I wrote a jazz waltz, sort of a slow jazz piece for her. Every composer, when they become a dad for the first time, they write this mushy baby ballad, and I wasn't going to do it, but then I got commissioned by a school that I have a great relationship with in Australia called Blackburn High School, and they wanted a ballad. And I'm like, all right, well, I'll write a piece, for Sarah. I'll call it Saraband. Of course, it's a little twisted, in my normal style. But anyway, so I wrote it, called it Saraband. And then that became, I had to do another 3-movement trilogy on this album that were all stories based on her and having a child and all the crazy things that involves. And the first movement is actually, it's called Conceivalization, and it's about making children. So, there's some big climaxes in that one. So I threw it all together because I like to tell these stories at the gig because they're entertaining and.
I noticed the big band is a very personal endeavor for you, and you mentioned that, like, for film music, you're very happy to work with other composers, but you've mentioned that for your music, you don't really like to be told what to do, and exactly. So your big band, it's really a lot of your individuality. The music is very personal to you.
Well, it's my outlet for me to just do whatever I want, which is weird because I am such a control freak, but I am extremely comfortable in the studio working for others, and I love that. And I think it's because I have my little sandpit though. I hate being in the booth. That's why I like conducting. The booth is the control room with everyone because I have no immediate control. Whereas when I'm out conducting, I can shape it with my hands and I can be the first one to say something, and it's my playground and everything. But then, the one reason I never wanted to write film music on my own was because you're being told what to write, and you could write this great piece of music and the director might even agree that it's a brilliant piece of music, but it just might not quite work with the scene, and you have to take the melody out or something like that, or change the chords. You've written this great thing, and it gets to this amazing chord, and then they're like, "We need that chord to happen 10 seconds earlier," and you're like, "That doesn't make any sense. How do I do that?" And then you always find a way, but you're always adapting. So the big band, is just my baby that I can write whatever I want, and no one. And I'm not trying to do it really for any commercial gain, so I don't have to think of who's going to like it. It's just what I do, and that's my thing. And I think it's important for anyone in my role here or doing this job to still have your outlet. My 2 main guys that work with me are Jeremy Levy. He's got a similar background to me, and he orchestrates with me on everything. He's got his own big band and writes for that, and that's his thing. He plays trombone. And Jordan Siegel's another guy that works with me now. He's written a big band album. He's just about to go in and do a new small group album, and that's what we do in our downtime is we all write and do these jazz things. Even though what we do during the day job, mostly has nothing to do with jazz anymore.
I want to end off, Tim, with a couple of quick questions. I forgot to ask you in your development phase. Do you have perfect pitch? Is that something that you have or you use? Or do you have like relative pitch where you're more with the tonal centers? And
yeah, I definitely don't have perfect pitch. I've always thought I've just got okay relative pitch. I can work things out. I've definitely done my fair share of takedowns, transcriptions. My first professional job in LA was working for a guy called John Clayton, who was he's a great big band arranger and bass player, and he was the director of jazz at the Hollywood Bowl for 3 years back in like 99 or 2000 or something like that. And the first thing he made me do is he gave me a cassette of a Johnny Mandel chart from the Basie Big Band, and I had to write it down, and then they played it the next week as a tribute to Johnny Mandel, who was in the crowd. So, that was quite nerve-wracking. And the most nerve-wracking takedown I ever did was the band Take Six. It's a vocal ensemble of 6-part vocals.
Oh, those harmonies are ridiculous.
Yeah, and John wanted to add the big band to it. So I had to write it down, and then he added a big band to it. But they couldn't make the rehearsal the day before. So the first time we heard all of this together, and the first time we sort of tested my takedown was on the stage at the Hollywood Bowl the afternoon of the concerts. That was the most nerve-wracking job I've ever done. But so I have decent pitch, and I've done a lot. I mean, these days, it's sort of not worth my time to sit there doing the takedowns if I'm doing string arrangements, like when I did Babyface or Kendrick Lamar and that sort of stuff. I'll have someone else will write it down and put it into finale for me. I'll check it, and then I might tweak it, but I'll have someone else. But the one thing I will say about the perfect pitch thing is I've found every time I've cheated and thought I will have a perfect pitch person do the takedown for me, it's been deficient in other ways. I find like because I have relative pitch and then use my brain to fill in the gaps, it's never incomplete. I know if it's a big band, then I can only hear 3 trumpets. I know there's a 4th one in there somewhere, and I use my skills to fill in the note. And I know that those notes, are only going to be in the trumpets, and these notes here are only going to be the trombones. I know exactly how it would be voiced based on the time period and everything. Whereas perfect pitch people tend to not have done that next or different type of analysis. They only write down what they hear. So if they don't hear because it's buried or it's a bad recording, that extra note in the trumpet, they just leave it out. Or they might put it in the wrong part. Or they might hear an F sharp in the ride cymbal overtone. All of a sudden it's in the trumpet. And so they have that. And they also have the worst sense of notation. Just because, again, they've skated through on this other skill. And for me, my job more, I've been successful more because, I know, like in the recording situation, if it's out of tune, everyone knows it's out of tune. The orchestra, they all know it's out of tune. The player that played the out of tune solo knows it. The people sitting next to them have already sort of, nudged them or looked at them if need be. Everyone knows. It's quite rare that I have to mention tuning or intonation in the recording studio. But when it comes to rhythm, it's amazing that they can all play the rhythm the wrong way together. I mean, as a pack, but also in a classical way. Like, we're trying to have them play like a rock band sometimes to line up with a track or a groove or a beat. And they're all still thinking like a classical orchestra. And I have to make them line up. So having a sense of rhythm and understanding the track and how it's all going to be put back together in Pro Tools is a greater skill in the recording studio than having perfect pitch, if that makes sense.
Right.
And knowing the instruments, obviously, intimately knowing how every instrument functions and what's hard and what's impossible and what, to understand, so then I can work out problems when we record. They're greater skills than perfect pitch.
Final question, the very last question before I let you go, Tim, is what advice can you give to somebody who wants to be a successful composer or orchestrator in the field of film, video games, or television? What advice can you give, looking back, if you could picture yourself back in college, or anybody who's young and upcoming and that really wants to get ahead in this industry? What's some advice you can give to that person? It's sort of 2 different ones. If you want to be a composer, then, you need to find your voice and just get a lot of music out there. There's so many people coming in now to the composing world that are just generic. They might be great technically, but they're never they will get a job doing additional music
for another composer, but they're not going to get their own score. And you see a lot of guys now getting scores that are coming from the indie world. Maybe they were in a band, or they have, indie composers. I mean, like sort of, classical, legit composers like Max Richter and all of that do a lot of everything. Mika Levy, they are musicians fully rounded, and they have their voice and their other projects, and they have music out there that you can hear. So directors and studios find the voice. Hans, for example, it used to be the way you would come through as being an assistant. Now he tends to, spend a lot of time listening to music, and then he'll hear someone's music and he'll invite them in. And that's how new people come in now, is not by starting there as an assistant working their way up. It's by having your own voice, having your own scores or your own albums or whatever out there. And he's like, wow, that's a great voice. I would like to collaborate with them. And he'll bring them in, and then they'll end up working on a big score. So, if you want to be a composer, do cinematic albums, put stuff on YouTube, put music out there that people can hear, and just keep writing a ton of music. And, you've got just as good a shot of getting in that way than you do, being an assistant, because, assisting often leads to more assisting and writing additional music, which is not your own gig. I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But, and if you want to be an orchestrator, then you have to hang out, with composers and have composer friends and have something else. I have my big band, so everyone knows I'm the guy with the big band. That's been my thing always. When people run into me and haven't seen me for a while, they don't ask how the weather is, or, when there's no topic, they say, when's the big band playing? And that's, I don't mind that. It's fine, because it's a good topic of discussion. But everyone knows that I have a big band. They'll never come and see it. They might not ever listen to it, but everyone knows. And it used to be that every time I would do a gig, I haven't done a gig here for a little bit because I've been so busy. But when I was regularly playing or first starting, it was a way I could email everyone that I'd met, be it a composer, a studio head, anyone, and just say, hey, you said let you know when I was playing. I'm playing next week, and they always remembered who I was then. So you have your thing, I guess, is what I'm saying with anything. Whether you want to be a composer. I mean, if I wanted to break into to arranging now, I would take songs that don't have any orchestra on or strings, and I would put my own unique take of what I would do on it, and then put that up on YouTube, until it got taken down. But then people would hear it, and then you might get invited to do that for someone, on a real scale.
I mean, Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show. He's got a wonderful orchestration blog, debreved.com. That's DEBREVED.com. And it's just a wonderful resource, and it's getting rave reviews from composers and orchestrators all over the world. He's such a mainstay in the industry, and it's such a pleasure to have you, Tim. I hope you had a good time on the show, too.
I did. Thank you so much for having me.
It was great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to my interview with the great orchestrator and conductor Tim Davies, a very special person who's worked on some of the biggest films and video games in history. I hope you enjoyed this interview, and please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you again, and I'll see you at the next show.